The first light of an autumn morning spilled across the Colorado prairie like liquid gold, touching every blade of grass with quiet fire. We could almost hear the earth waking beneath Rusty's steady hoofbeats as Ethan Walker guided his faithful chestnut quarter horse along a forgotten cattle trail that wound between weathered cottonwoods and rolling hills. Morning was Ethan's favorite companion. It never hurried. It never lied. And on mornings like this, when cool mist floated above the creek and hawks circled silently overhead, a man could almost believe the world still kept its promises. Ethan adjusted the brim of his black felt hat against the rising sun. His weathered brown trail coat shifted in the crisp breeze, while Rusty slowed near a shallow crossing where years of wagon wheels had carved deep ruts into the earth. Then something caught Ethan's eye. A tiny glimmer, not bright enough to be gold at first glance, just enough to interrupt the peaceful rhythm of the ride. He gently pulled Rusty to a stop. "What is it, old friend?" he murmured. Rusty flicked his ears forward. Ethan dismounted, his worn leather boots crunching softly against gravel as he walked toward the edge of the trail. Half buried beneath fallen leaves rested a simple gold wedding ring. It wasn't polished. It wasn't expensive. Years of weather had dulled its shine until it almost blended into the earth itself. Someone could have ridden past it 100 times without ever noticing. Ethan knelt carefully. He brushed away damp leaves with the back of his leather glove before lifting the ring into his palm. For a long moment, he simply stared. There was something strangely comforting about finding something so personal in such a lonely place. Before we continue this journey, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy heartfelt Western stories about kindness, hope, and second chances. Every subscription helps us bring more frontier tales to life, and we'd be honored to have you ride with us. Ethan turned the ring slowly between his fingers. The morning sunlight caught its worn edges. Years had left tiny scratches across the surface. This wasn't jewelry someone had casually thrown away. This had been worn every day. Loved every day. He rubbed away a layer of dirt with his thumb. Inside the band, something was engraved. The letters were faint. Time had nearly erased them. Ethan narrowed his calm blue eyes and tilted the ring toward the sunlight. Little by little, the inscription became clear. "Forever yours, Hannah and Thomas." He read it once. Then again. The words carried a quiet weight that settled deep inside him. Whoever Hannah and Thomas had been, this ring had belonged to a promise. Promises weren't supposed to end beside dusty cattle trails. Ethan slipped the ring carefully into the inside pocket of his vest rather than dropping it into a saddlebag. Some things deserved better than being tossed among ropes and horseshoes. He climbed back into the saddle. "Looks like we've got ourselves a small errand, Rusty." The horse snorted softly. Together they continued along the trail toward the nearest ranches. The autumn countryside unfolded around them in peaceful silence. Golden cottonwood leaves drifted through the air. Split-rail fences stretched across open meadows where cattle grazed lazily beneath an endless blue sky. Smoke curled gently from distant chimneys. Life moved slowly here, just the way Ethan preferred it. Near midday he reached a small trading stop where an elderly storekeeper recognized the names engraved inside the ring almost immediately. "Hannah Collins?" the man said thoughtfully. "Collins Ranch sits about 5 miles east." His smile faded. "Hasn't been much laughter there in a long while." Ethan simply nodded. He thanked the man and turned Rusty toward the eastern hills. The road became narrower. Grass grew taller. The fences leaned with age. Eventually the Collins Ranch came into view. The house stood alone, beneath towering cottonwood trees, whose amber leaves covered the yard like a faded blanket. Paint peeled from the porch railings. One shutter hung crooked. The barn still stood proudly, but time had clearly demanded its share. Even the wind seemed quieter here. Rusty stopped near the front gate. Ethan removed his hat before walking toward the porch. He knocked gently. No answer. He waited, then knocked again. Slow footsteps echoed inside the house. The door opened only a few inches. Standing there was a woman in a faded forest green prairie dress, with a cream apron tied neatly around her waist. Her chestnut brown hair rested in a simple braid over one shoulder. Gentle hazel eyes studied Ethan with understandable caution. Years of quiet sorrow lingered behind them. "Can I help you?" she asked softly. Ethan spoke with the same calm respect he offered everyone. "I hope so, ma'am." He reached slowly into his vest pocket. "I believe this belongs to you." He opened his hand. The old gold wedding ring rested in his palm. For one endless heartbeat, she simply stared. Her breathing stopped. Color drained from her face. Her hand trembled as she stepped forward. Those tired hazel eyes widened with complete disbelief. She looked from the ring to Ethan and back again. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "I buried this with my husband. I buried this with my husband." The words barely escaped Hannah Collins' lips before she reached for the weathered gold ring with trembling fingers. We could almost feel the years collapsing around her as she cradled it carefully in both hands, afraid it might disappear again if she held it too tightly. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Only the gentle autumn breeze stirred the amber cottonwood leaves across the porch. Ethan quietly replaced his hat against his chest. "I found it beside the old North Trail," he said softly, "near the creek crossing." Hannah lowered her eyes to the faded engraving. "Forever yours, Hannah and Thomas." Her fingertips traced the familiar letters. "I watched them place it on his hand," she whispered. "I remember touching it one last time before they closed the casket." Her voice cracked. But when the family gathered at the graveside, the ring was gone. She looked toward the distant hills, as though the memory still waited there. "We searched everywhere." Inside the modest ranch house, warm afternoon sunlight spilled across worn wooden floors. A single photograph rested above the stone fireplace. Thomas Collins, tall, strong, smiling beneath a broad cowboy hat. Fresh flowers stood beside the frame. Someone still replaced them faithfully. Hannah gently invited Ethan inside. The house carried the quiet stillness of a place where grief had stayed far longer than visitors. 10-year-old Lily Collins stepped carefully from the kitchen doorway. She paused when she saw the ring resting in her mother's hands. "Mama." Hannah knelt and wrapped one arm around her daughter. "It's your father's." Lily's eyes filled with quiet wonder. "I've only seen it in pictures." She reached out carefully, touching the worn band with one fingertip, as though greeting someone she had missed her entire life. Ethan remained respectfully silent. Some moments belonged only to families. After several quiet minutes, Hannah poured fresh coffee into 3 worn cups. "I should tell you what happened," she said. Years earlier, Thomas Collins had fallen from his horse during a difficult autumn cattle drive. The injuries were severe. Despite every effort made by neighbors and the town doctor, he never recovered. The funeral brought nearly everyone in the valley. Friends, ranchers, the sheriff, the local minister. Hannah herself had slipped the wedding ring back onto Thomas's finger before saying goodbye. But after the service, she continued, someone noticed it was missing. No one admitted seeing it removed. No one knew when it disappeared. Rumors spread anyway. Some whispered that grave robbers had taken it. Others believed someone had stolen it before the burial. The uncertainty hurt almost as much as losing Thomas himself. "I tried not to believe any of it," Hannah said quietly. "But every time I looked at his photograph," she glanced toward the fireplace, "I wondered how his wedding ring could simply vanish." Silence settled over the room once again. Finally, Ethan spoke. "If the ring was lying beside that trail all these years," he stopped, carefully choosing his next words, "it may have never reached the cemetery." Hannah slowly looked up. The thought had clearly never occurred to her. Ethan leaned forward. "I'd like to retrace exactly where I found it." Sheriff Nathan Briggs had served the valley for decades. If anyone still remembered the events surrounding Thomas's funeral, it would be him. Hannah nodded slowly. "If there's even the smallest chance of finally knowing," her voice softened, "I'd like the truth." The following morning dawned cool and clear. Golden sunlight stretched across the prairie as Ethan mounted Rusty once more. Sheriff Nathan Briggs joined him outside the Collins Ranch, adjusting his black sheriff's hat against the breeze. "I remember that funeral," the sheriff admitted. "Never did sit right with me." Together they rode toward the lonely creek crossing where Ethan had discovered the ring. The trail looked unchanged despite the passing years. Cottonwood roots still twisted beneath the dusty road. The creek still murmured over smooth stones. Rusty slowed naturally near the exact place Ethan had stopped the previous morning. Sheriff Briggs dismounted and studied the ground carefully. Most evidence had disappeared long ago. Rain, snow, passing cattle. Time erased nearly everything. Almost. Near the edge of the crossing stood the remains of an old wooden wagon bridge that had collapsed years before. The sheriff knelt beside several weathered timbers, brushing away layers of leaves that had gathered through countless autumns. His experienced eyes narrowed. Half buried beneath damp soil rested something small, very small. He lifted it carefully. A tarnished brass button. Old, handmade. Unlike modern clothing, the sheriff turned it over thoughtfully. Recognition slowly crossed his weathered face. "I remember this." Ethan looked toward him. The sheriff stared quietly across the creek. Then, almost to himself, he said, "Someone tried to protect her." He closed his fingers gently around the old button. "Not rob her." "Someone tried to protect her, not rob her." Sheriff Nathan Briggs' quiet words lingered in the cool mountain air. As we stood beside the forgotten creek crossing, the little brass button rested in his weathered palm while Ethan Walker looked across the slow-moving water, sensing that a story long buried beneath years of silence was finally ready to be told. The sheriff slipped the button carefully into his coat pocket. "I know exactly whose coat this came from," he said. Ethan waited. "It belonged to Reverend Samuel Harper." The name surprised him. "The Reverend?" Sheriff Briggs nodded. "He helped prepare Thomas Collins for burial." Neither man spoke for several moments. The pieces no longer seemed as impossible as they once had. If Reverend Harper had been the last person to handle Thomas before the funeral, perhaps he alone knew what had truly happened to the wedding ring. By late afternoon they arrived at the small white church overlooking the valley. Golden cottonwood leaves drifted gently across the stone pathway leading to the front door. Inside, warm sunlight filtered through colored glass windows, painting soft patterns across the wooden pews. Reverend Samuel Harper looked up from his desk as the two men entered. His kind blue eyes immediately settled on Sheriff Briggs. "You've come about Thomas," he said quietly. Neither Ethan nor the sheriff had spoken a single word. The elderly minister simply smiled. I wondered if this day would ever come. He slowly opened an old cedar cabinet beside his desk. From its highest shelf, he removed a small leather-bound journal. Dust covered its worn cover. "I wrote this after every funeral," he explained, "so no family would ever have unanswered questions." He carefully turned the yellowed pages until he stopped. Thomas Collins. The room grew still. The Reverend adjusted his spectacles before reading softly. "Before his passing, Thomas removed his wedding ring and placed it into my hand." Ethan exchanged a surprised glance with Sheriff Briggs. The Reverend continued. "He feared that swelling in his injured hand would permanently trap the ring beneath the skin if it remained there much longer." He paused. "He asked me to return it to Hannah after the burial, privately." Sheriff Briggs frowned. "Then why wasn't it returned?" The old minister closed the journal for a moment. His shoulders lowered with quiet regret. "Because I failed." He looked toward the church window. "After the funeral, I rode toward the Collins ranch, carrying the ring inside my coat pocket." His voice softened. "A frightened horse bolted across the trail. I was thrown into the creek. My coat tore badly. I never realized the ring had slipped from my pocket." He reached into a small wooden box resting beside the journal. Inside lay the matching brass button. "I found this button missing when I returned home." Sheriff Briggs slowly removed the weathered button from his own pocket. The two pieces matched perfectly. For more than a decade, the answer had waited inside an old journal and beside a forgotten creek. Not because of theft, not because of greed, simply because of one tragic accident. That evening, Ethan rode quietly toward the Collins ranch. The golden light of sunset stretched across the fields as Rusty's steady hoofbeats echoed softly along the familiar road. Hannah met him on the porch before he even dismounted. She could tell by his eyes. "You found something." Ethan gently told her everything. About the journal. About Reverend Harper. About Thomas removing the ring himself. About the creek. About the lost button. When he finished, Hannah covered her mouth with trembling fingers. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks. For years, she had carried a quiet question that never allowed her heart to rest. Now, it was finally answered. "There was never a thief," she whispered. Ethan slowly shook his head. "Only a man trying to honor your husband's final wish." Hannah closed her eyes. A burden she had carried for years seemed to lift all at once. The following morning, she walked toward the small family cemetery for the first time in many months. Lily quietly slipped her small hand into her mother's. Together they carried fresh autumn flowers. Ethan remained respectfully behind, giving them the privacy they deserved. The breeze moved gently through the tall prairie grass surrounding Thomas Collins' simple headstone. Hannah knelt. She placed the flowers carefully beneath the stone. Then she opened a small wooden keepsake box. Inside rested the wedding ring. She smiled through her tears. "I know now," she whispered. "I finally know." For the first time since Thomas's passing, she didn't feel abandoned. She felt understood. Nearby, Lily looked toward Ethan. "Thank you," she said softly. "You brought my mama back." Those simple words stayed with Ethan longer than any reward ever could. As the afternoon sun warmed the quiet ranch once more, laughter drifted from the porch. Only a little, but enough. Enough for the old house to feel alive again. As evening settled over the valley, Hannah turned toward Ethan with a gentle smile that hadn't crossed her face in years. Then, almost shyly, she asked, "Would you stay for supper?" "Would you stay for supper?" The question lingered gently in the cool autumn air as we watched Hannah Collins stand on the porch with a quiet smile. It wasn't simply an invitation to share a meal. It was the first time in years that she had invited anyone into her home without grief standing beside her. Ethan removed his hat respectfully. "I'd be honored." That evening, the Collins ranch felt different. Warm lantern light spilled across the kitchen, while Lily happily helped set the worn wooden table. Fresh bread cooled beside a pot of beef stew, and the comforting smell filled every corner of the little farmhouse. Conversation came slowly at first. Years of silence are not forgotten in a single day. But little by little, stories replaced sorrow. Lily laughed while telling Ethan about the calf that always escaped its pasture. Hannah smiled as she listened. It was a smile that reached her eyes. Outside, Rusty grazed peacefully beneath the amber leaves, while the stars slowly appeared above the Colorado sky. For the first time in many years, the Collins home sounded like a home again. 4. The next morning, Ethan prepared to continue his journey. He saddled Rusty quietly before sunrise. As he tightened the saddle strap, Hannah stepped onto the porch carrying a small basket. "Breakfast for the trail," she said. Ethan accepted it with grateful hands. "You've already given me more than enough." Hannah gently shook her head. "No. You returned something I believed I'd lost forever." As Ethan rode through the front gate, Lily waved until he disappeared beyond the cottonwood trees. Neither of them realized they would see him again much sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, an early autumn storm swept across the valley. Strong winds damaged several sections of the Collins Ranch fencing. By morning, dozens of cattle had wandered into neighboring pasture. Before Hannah could even saddle her horse, a familiar rider appeared through the morning mist. Ethan. Without a single word, he dismounted and quietly began repairing broken fence rails. By midday, another rider arrived. Then another. Sheriff Nathan Briggs. Reverend Samuel Harper. Neighboring ranchers. Word had quietly spread throughout the valley. No one had organized the effort. No one needed to. People simply remembered Hannah's kindness over the years. By sunset, nearly every damaged fence stood strong once again. Lily watched in amazement, The whole town came. Reverend Harper smiled warmly. Sometimes kindness takes a long road before it finds its way home. Sup. As autumn slowly turned toward winter, life returned to the Collins Ranch. The barn echoed once more with healthy horses. Fresh hay filled the loft. Neighbors stopped by without needing an excuse. Children's laughter drifted across the fields. Even the old farmhouse seemed brighter beneath the morning sun. One quiet afternoon, Hannah carefully carried a small handcrafted wooden keepsake box into the sitting room. Thomas's framed photograph rested above the fireplace. Fresh wildflowers stood beside it. She gently opened the box. Inside rested the weathered gold wedding ring. She smiled softly. It belongs here now. She placed the box beneath the photograph, not as a reminder of loss, but as a reminder of love that had endured. Nearby, Lily slipped her hand into her mother's. "It looks happy there." Hannah nodded. "So am I." So, months passed. Spring finally returned to the Colorado frontier. Rolling meadows burst into brilliant green. Wildflowers painted the hillsides with color. Cottonwoods wore fresh leaves once more. The Collins Ranch had become one of the busiest in the valley again. One bright morning, Ethan rode past while driving a small group of cattle toward the northern pasture. As he approached the familiar farmhouse, the front door opened. Hannah stood there smiling, not because she was waiting for someone to ease her grief, but because she had learned to welcome life again. Lily raced across the yard, laughing as Rusty lowered his head for a friendly pat. Ethan smiled beneath the brim of his black felt hat. He tipped it politely before continuing down the trail. Halfway across the meadow, he turned for one last look. Behind him, the front door remained open. Warm sunlight poured through it. Children's laughter floated into the spring air. Hope had quietly taken grief's place. Sometimes we imagine that healing arrives all at once. But more often, it begins with one honest act. One returned treasure. One gentle knock on a lonely front door. And sometimes the greatest thing we return isn't what was lost. It's the courage to live again. Thank you for riding this journey with us. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more wholesome frontier tales of kindness, hope, and second chances. Until our next adventure, may the trail ahead always lead you home.